Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, and to the staff from the ministry. Really appreciate you all being here. And I just wanted to really acknowledge you for what you were saying earlier about focusing on relationships. I think that that is probably the biggest priority in this particular ministry, and I do want to commend you. I think that you've done a good job of that. I think there's still lots to do, but I certainly appreciate your efforts. And I'm also very conscious that I'm always learning in this role as a critic for this particular ministry, and I've learned a lot today, both from you and from MLA Hansen. It's obvious that you both have a great deal of passion about this particular portfolio, and yeah, it's been a learning experience so far. So I will just jump into it. I'm going to talk first about reconciliation. So in the business plan, right at the beginning, setting the context, part of what the context includes is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's final report. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold. And one thing that I'm not too clear on when I was reading through this was whether the calls to action are part of that, or if it's just the report itself.
No, the calls to action will be definitely part of it. Now, you may know that those calls to action are written quite widely, and so not all of them apply to any particular level of government or any particular community group. Some apply to provincial government, some to municipal, some to school boards, some to the Pope. As a result, we took a look at them all, and we have committed to, wherever possible, trying to implement those calls to action. But the primary way that we responded was the call to action that particularly requested that we adhere to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And that started that whole process for us. So if you want to sort of look at what are we doing to respond to the calls to action, the process of the 20 recommendations that came out of the United Nations Declaration and subsequent other actions are a fulfillment of the things we learned from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I personally attended, as I know many people did, when it was here in Edmonton, and as you know, those experiences stay with you. They are very profound, and we have, as a result, tried to be honest to our experiences and our learning at that time, and really make changes in government behavior, and our relationships with the community, and make it a real difference in terms of our policies and practices moving forward.
Thank you. And in doing that, in the relationship with First Nations in Alberta, have you solicited from the communities what their priorities are? So in terms of the 94 calls to action, have priorities been identified by the communities? And if so, how are you going about addressing them?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I just indicated, that in our conversations with Grand Chief Willie Littlechild, for example, who was one of the commissioners in the TRC, and in fact was one of the authors of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We're quite a privilege in this province to have someone like that, and other people like that. We talked about how do we move forward, what's the best way, because we were terrified of governments sort of going, oh, okay, we've got some great ideas, and we're just going to fix everything, and just a terrible way to go about doing it. And so as a result, the advice we were given at that time was that the United Nations Declaration was the best way to fulfill the TRC. I know they're separate documents, but they actually come together. Now, of course, we've read both, and we act on both. But our list of ideas, initiatives from the United Nations Declaration have been largely motivated by that whole process. In addition, of course, we have issues such as venues such as the Treaty 8 Protocol Table and the Blackfoot Confederacy Protocol Table, where there is a particular table set up to look at those kind of issues. In both cases, I am the minister responsible for that particular initiative, and it gives us a chance to talk about ways that we can live those documents rather than just simply filling out small pieces of it. And in addition, we have two commissions. We have the First Nations Women's Socioeconomic Committee and the Métis Women's Socioeconomic Committee. And both of those committees have been populated with highly respected people from the community, women. Both of them have 12 members on them, plus an elder. And they're highly respected. They had to go through a process of being interviewed and getting on there. And they have also been tasked with, how do we live TRC? How do we live United Nations Declaration? And they have really done incredible things to help us do that. And that's led to some of our work, for example, around women in violence, are increasing the amount of money to women's shelters, and particularly shelters on reserve has happened this year, to the Musai campaign, which you see me wearing today, those kind of things, to putting more women in positions of decision-making in government. So you may know now that we have a very strong policy about whenever we're fulfilling positions on agency boards and committees, we are inviting First Nations women as well as everyone else, but ensuring that First Nations women's voices are heard on those committees. And then, of course, we also wrote into our agreement, our framework agreement with the Métis Nation of Alberta, to do similar kinds of pieces of work where they inform us what is their experience of the TRC, what is their experience of the United Nations Declaration, and how do we fulfill those pieces. And finally, I had one last piece. I've already mentioned the training of all the Alberta Public Service employees, and we will see some great movements forward as we educate people both in our school system with our curriculum review and in our public service employees through our training that will occur over the next 5 years and train in some, 85,000 or more people. So lots of commitment.
Thank you. So just a couple of follow-on questions, because it sounds like the UN Declaration and the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action operate more as a framework or a lens to view work through. Would that be a fair assessment?
Well, I'm not sure that that's quite the framework. We have really committed to the United Nations Declaration, and we say that that we accept it. And when you accept it, then it's about living it afterwards, and it's about
demonstrating that
in practical ways. But we've also really committed to making sure that we don't get ahead of ourselves on this, that we're always working with the communities,
right,
and not saying, oh, well, we'll make up our minds as to what happens and then we'll just do them. Because, of course, that would be a disaster, and you know what happens when you make assumptions about what's good for someone else.
Yes.
And so what you'll see is much more of an organic process. I'm sure I'm a social worker by training. Process is very, very important. And as a result, we don't just simply make a list of tasks and go ahead and do them. We figure out a process. We invite people in. The 60 Scoop process is a reflection of, we were going to do this differently. We weren't going to just, do an apology and stand up and say, we're sorry, and move on, just to check off a box. We could have done that, and it would have checked off a TRC box, right? But instead, we said, we're working with the community. We're going to empower them, enhance their ability to work with us, set out a process together, fulfill that process together, and make changes in how we do things as much as what we do.
Okay, thank you. What I'm trying to get at here is how can we follow where the work is at? How do we know? And I understand that it will never be 100% we're done.
No, good.
But how do we stay apprised of where TRC and UN Declaration are at play in the work that your ministry is doing?
Well, one of the things that I would say to you is that because it's truly embedded in terms of a philosophy of how you do things, it should actually be evident in everything we do. It's not that there is, we're trying to stay away from some simplistic kind of list of things we do. Now, of course, there are technical ways that you can learn about the things we do. Our annual report, our business plan, those kind of things outlay some of the particular projects we're engaged in. But you should see it in terms of how we actually conduct ourselves as a government. The fact that we have water to reserve, the fact that we have money put toward off-reserve housing, the fact that we have money in the Climate Leadership Initiative, and just how we go about doing it. The Climate Leadership Initiative, for example, not only do we have this money in these great 7 programs where we've had 124 applications approved just in this 1 year alone, but We also have sat down with the nations and said, look, we have this money. Well, what do we need to do to actually give you power and control over this money? And so last year...
I'm going to interrupt you because
sorry, yes,
I don't have a lot of time.
Okay, sorry.
And I will get to that.
Yep.
And I was really looking for the information about the TRC and
Yep.
UN declaration, so
Please
thank
go.
you very much. And just tied in with that, I think it's a little bit... not so clear, but in terms of new public infrastructure that's being built, so hospitals, community centers, or community infrastructure, schools, how has the government ensured that there is space available for Indigenous people to be able to continue, let's say, a smudging ceremony in a school?
Mm-hmm.
Is that part of developing an infrastructure plan?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that we did, when we gave out that United Nations Declaration, is we made sure that every single ministry had it, not just Ministry of Indigenous Relations. Right. So transportation, infrastructure, justice, education, advanced education, all were asked the same thing. And we follow that up internally in a number of different ways. One is that we have deep communication between our deputy minister and, of course, other people in the department and their counterparts in all the ministries. And also, whenever anything comes to cabinet, one of the things that we have instituted that did not exist before is a lens of Indigenous relations. So how does this affect Indigenous people particularly? So every cabinet report addresses that as a question.
Okay.
And it's just a way for us to follow up on making sure that we're not just talking the talk, but we're actually living it in a day-to-day way. Okay,
thanks. I am going to move on to the 60 Scoop. Through the process that the government has gone through, there are certainly a number of records that have been created as a result of that to be able to document exactly what happened, because I think it's been identified that one of the great tragedies of where we are right now is a lot of history has not been captured. And so how could we possibly learn from the past if we're not even aware of what happened? So in the exercise of going through this with First Nations people, have you made the records available to all of the survivors and their families?
We haven't made a complete decision on what's happening with the records. As you can imagine, we've amassed a significant numbers of records. Some of them we need to be responsible from a FOIP perspective on. Other ones maybe less so. Now, we had a number of different processes. When we actually met with families coming forward or individuals coming to our sessions, we had recorders writing things down, so they were actually watching what was being written down of the words that they were saying, and gave us permission to gather those pieces. We also had a computer program that allowed people to write in those kind of things. And we also had artwork, so that we have a number of huge panels that were created in that process. We're in the process of working with the 60 Scoop Survivor Society to make decisions about the availability and access to all of those things, because, of course, they've addressed that same question, and we're moving forward in that way. Well, we do have to protect the FOIP pieces, but we're trying to get the statements of their stories without identifying individuals available to as many people as possible.
Well, and I think it's really important for the community at large to be able to not take advantage, but be able to learn, to be able to find out what exactly did happen. Because unless you're really proactive about it, it can be a challenge to understand the context of where we are today. Because it isn't something that we learned about in school when we were growing up. I do have a question here that maybe you'll incorporate it in the next year. Sure. Does the budget include the creation of a dashboard? So if somebody either who testified or who is interested wanted to get information, wanted access to that information, is there a one-stop place where that person could go and easily access that information?
It is part of the dialogue with the 60 Scoop Survivor Society about how we will use that information, and who owns it is actually part of the issue for us, and we're working very cooperatively with them on that. I suspect that you should be looking in Children's Services next year for finances related to it, because they're the lead ministry with regard to dollars and organization moving forward.
Okay, thank you.
Of course, we'll be there, but our role in this ministry is different than others. We facilitate more than we fund.
Well, I would think then, if nothing like that has been put into place, that if people did want to get any of the records, they would be obliged to use a FOIP request to be able to do that. Is that correct?
Well, we're trying to avoid putting barriers in where possible. And so whenever possible, we're trying to find a way to have access to stories or learnings without identifying individuals, so therefore we can avoid some of the FOIP issues. But we're trying to obey the laws. So we're moving forward carefully with the 60 Scoop Survivor Society and making some of the decisions over the next little while. But the idea of having as you say, some kind of a dashboard where people could go and use it as a resource for schools, or church groups, child welfare agencies, social work programs like I taught in. I think it'd be a wonderful idea, and I will make sure that we address it.
I just facilitated a conversation last weekend between Syrian refugee women and First Nations women in Calgary, and a resource like that would be such a huge benefit to be able to bridge those gaps in understanding one another. So I would really love to see something like that.
Yeah.
I think it would be a huge benefit.
I agree with you 100%.
I'm going to move on to the climate leadership plan. And as a fraction of the overall climate leadership initiative, how, like, the Indigenous in climate leadership initiative, what fraction is that of the overall plan?
It would be about 2.8%, I think. 2.8, yes. I did remember. 2.8%. But one of the things the nations have addressed that with me as well. One of the things I also want to remind you is that the First Nations and the Métis communities have access to the larger plans, the same as every other Albertan does. This is only 2.8% that is specifically dedicated to the First Nations and Métis communities, and this is the amount of money that at this particular time that has increased this year up to $53 million, just over $53 million. And the amount of money that we are also looking at to turn over to a First Nations and Métis-led governance structure. That's the one we've been working on for well over a year. But it's been a very successful process. In fact, we just met this last week with the First Nations and Métis communities, and I was amazed. I had set up 3 meetings in the spring last year, April, May, and June, to meet with all these people to say, can we get together to create this governance structure? And they basically fired me somewhere at the end of that, not because they were upset with what I was doing, but they were taking it on. They said, you're right, but we need to do this. So they went away. They had some committees. And when I walked into the room, and I was invited to last week, I looked around and I saw maybe 100 leaders in that room who were sitting around. And they told me it was the first time that the Métis Nation, the Métis Settlements General Council, and the First Nations in this province had sat together and worked on a policy issue together since the 1982 constitutional crisis. Wow. So this has been a very successful process because we paid attention to the process, because it was built on relationship, and now we're going to be able to take those dollars and turn it over to that group and say, you now not only have the dollars, but you have the ability to make decisions for your communities and what's best.
I only have a couple minutes here. What is the number of green jobs generated in Alberta's Indigenous communities last year through the Climate Leadership Program? Can you table how that breaks down by community, and what's the target this year?
As you can imagine, I will have to get back to you with those kind of details, but I can tell you that it's been quite wonderful. We've been able to not only take our dollars, but the federal government has also put dollars into green energy jobs, and we have used that money to enhance some of our programming. And as a result, there are many nations that are creating jobs, such as the Green Arrow program that we discussed earlier in Montana, but many other nations as well. So.
A similar question, what's the economic impact of the development generated by Alberta's Indigenous communities through the Climate Leadership Program? Again, please table how that breaks down by community and what the target is this year as well.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate the questions. One other thing I might want to mention that the economic benefits here are about to just bloom. I don't know how else to put it, because we have First Nations that have been invited for the very first time into the energy system in this province. And in our REP 2, we made a requirement that if they wanted to provide renewable energies into this province, that they needed to make sure that First Nations were at the table, and that included not just jobs. Sorry.
Thank you, Minister. We will now take a 5-minute break and